Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away, the systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the Capitol relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. Picture the arena after the 75th Hunger Games. No mutts, no cannons, just smoking ruins, broken force fields, and a sky that finally goes dark. On paper, the games have stopped, but here's the real question. Does that silence mean peace, or just a pause before the next version of the show? You walk through an empty victor's village, past 12 perfect houses in District 12 that somehow survived when everything else burned. Number children playing. No cameras for once, just wind in the trees and Snow's white roses still rotting in a vase. At face value, this is what victory is supposed to look like. The war is over, the Capitol has fallen, peace is restored. So why does it still feel like an arena after the anthem has finished? If the Hunger Games were only Snow's personal obsession, they should die with him. Tear down the arenas, scrap the victor's village, melt the Mockingjay pin into something harmless, and move on. But what if the games were never meant to end, even after the rebellion won? What if the structure outlives whoever happens to sit in the presidential mansion? There is a lot to uncover here, because the games aren't just an event. They're a relationship between the Capitol and the districts. The Treaty of Treason literally writes them into law as the price of rebellion. Every year, each district sends children, watches them die, and is forced to celebrate the one survivor. That part matters because it turns state violence into a national habit. You don't just stop a habit with a speech. So when Coin steps up and talks about a free Panem, you have to ask, free from what exactly? The arenas are rubble, but the cameras are still there. The hunger is still there. The need for a spectacle, for a clear enemy, for a sacrificial body that promises everyone else a little more hope and a little more safety, that logic doesn't evaporate with Snow's blood. This is where we talk about the contradiction. The official narrative says the games are over and peace is restored, but the victors are still walking weapons. The districts are still traumatized. The Capitol population has spent 75 years cheering for child murder on live television. How do you flip that culture off like a light switch? Look at the symbols we think of as resistance. Victor's village looks peaceful, but it's a ready-made stage for whoever needs compliant heroes. The arenas can be repurposed as memorials or prisons. Even the Mockingjay, this emblem of rebellion, becomes Coin's favorite prop in her propose. We're going to cover how easily each of these pieces slides from Snow's hand into Coin's. By the end of the story, Panem can swap costumes from Snow to Coin, from arena to propaganda reel. But it can't just walk away from the core logic of the games. And in the rest of this video, we're going to ask why ending the broadcasts doesn't necessarily end the games at all. From bloodbath to quiet streets, why victory never ends the games, What does that actually look like on the ground? You zoom from the arena to a single image, the cornucopia bloodbath. Screaming, mud slick with blood. Kids scrambling for knives they barely know how to hold. The camera cuts fast, the Capitol roars, and you can almost feel the sponsors reaching for their wallets. That's the games at their most obvious. Chaos, spectacle, punishment in HD. Now jump to Victor's village at dawn. No screaming, no crowds. Just pristine streets, identical houses, and a silence so heavy it feels staged. At face value, this is the reward. You survive the cornucopia, you get a mansion and hot water, and a fence between you and the starving part of your own district. But here's the real question. Why does this silence feel just as weaponized as the screaming? Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you win. They just change format. So why does Katniss still sleep with a bow nearby? Why does Haymitch drink himself into oblivion in a house big enough for a family he'll never have? Why do districts still hold their breath on reaping day, even when they technically have a champion living on the hill? There is a lot to uncover here, because victory in Panem isn't freedom, it's a promotion. You go from tribute to asset, from hunted animal in the arena to trained showpiece in the Capitol's ecosystem. You mentor, you appear on talk shows, you answer Snow's phone calls. You're exempt from the reaping, but not from the games. That part matters because it explains why the Capitol keeps investing in Victor's villages even during wartime. They need a permanent cast, not just seasonal contestants. Victor's village is the physical proof that the games have moved into your home. Your kitchen becomes a set when the cameras arrive. Your relationships are suddenly part of the script. Family members threatened, lovers staged, or broken apart for ratings. Your public image is no longer yours. It's a product the Capitol edits, sells, and punishes you with. And for the districts watching, that quiet street is its own kind of cornucopia. It dangles the promise of safety, food, and status, but only if you play. So why does the Capitol still need a spectacle even when bombs are falling? Why does Snow keep sending victors back in the Quarterquell? Why does Coin later reach for a symbolic Hunger Games, using Capitol children instead of abolishing the system outright? This is where we talk about stakes. Understanding why the games can't end peacefully isn't trivia. It's the reason Snow clings to the arena and the reason Coin almost rebuilds it in a new color. If victory just turns you into another tool, what happens when an entire war is fought by people who only know how to be weapons? And more importantly, what happens to a country that can't remember how to stop watching? Our lens on Panem. How this video is going to break the games open. So if the country can't stop watching, here's the real question. What if the games were never designed to stop at all? Not with a rebellion, not with a treaty, not even with a so-called victory. At face value, the Hunger Games are an annual event. A punishment, a reminder, a horrible show you're forced to sit through while your district holds its breath. But the more you zoom out, the more they stop looking like a single arena and start looking like operating software for Panem. The games rewrite how politics works, how food moves, how people love their children. Pull that code out too fast and the whole system crashes. This is where we talk about the games as a political technology, not just cruelty. Engineering. The Treaty of Treason doesn't just legalize a spectacle, it hardwires an expectation. Every year, 2 children die on camera. One comes back rich, and everyone pretends that's order. The capital gets a steady flow of resources and entertainment. The districts get terror, but also this tiny poisonous thread of hope that maybe their kid will be the one who makes it. And that's where Victor's village comes in as our main lens. On paper, it's the reward screen. You win, you get a mansion, hot water, full power, no more reaping. Your district gets food and celebrations. We're going to cover how that promise is exactly what keeps the games running. Because the village doesn't just house victors, it repurposes them. They're pulled into mentoring, media tours, talents, direct lines to the capital. Their trauma becomes a permanent feature of governance. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you step off the train. Haymitch's decayed house, Katniss and Peter rattling around in an empty row of 12 identical homes, the mandatory interviews, the sexual exploitation we only glimpse in the books, none of that is a bug. That part matters because it turns every victor into a living weapon aimed back at their own district. You see them on screen, draped in wealth, and the message is clear. The only legal path out of your life is through the arena. So the capital sells a promise of glory and security. But what do they actually manufacture? Permanent instability, a generation of adults who can't sleep, can't trust, can't stop performing. Districts that depend on victory bonuses to survive another winter. A culture that treats children's deaths as mandatory national programming. You can't just flip that off and call it peace. There is a lot to uncover here. Snow's pre-planned quarter quells that bake escalation into the system from the start. Coin's proposal for a symbolic final games with capital children, proving even the rebels default to the same ritual. And the eerie fact that after District 12 is bombed, Victor's village is what survives, waiting, intact, for the next regime to move in. So the real question beneath all of this is simple and terrifying. If the games are the operating system of Panem, what happens to a country that tries to delete them without rewriting itself from the ground up? The map of the madness, how we'll take apart the Hunger Games machine. So if Panem can't just uninstall the games without crashing the whole system, where do we even start picking this apart? To make sense of why peace never really had a shot, we need a map of the madness. Not just a tour of the arena, but the whole operating system wrapped around it. First, we're going to cover the origin story. Back then, before Victor's village existed, the Treaty of Treason hard-codes the games in as punishment and control. You think about those early years. Brutal, messy, no glossy promise attached. So why the change? Why go from you will suffer to you might win a mansion in a single generation? That part matters because it tells you when the capital realized fear alone wasn't enough to keep the districts in line. From there, we zoom in on the crown jewel of that pivot, Victor's village. At face value, it's a reward. Win the games, escape the reaping, move your family into a perfect little capital-approved suburb. But here's the real question. What kind of reward comes with mandatory mentoring, direct phone lines to your oppressors, and a life built around reliving your trauma on camera? This is where we talk about its creation, how it's placed on a hill in District 12, how Haymitch's rotting house sits next to Katniss's pristine one, and why the book's emptier, more individualized layout hits so much harder than the more compressed movie version. Then we widen the lens again. How does this system work psychologically, not just on one victor, but on an entire district? We'll look at why children have to watch, why each district is forced to celebrate their own tribute's survival, and how the capital turns state violence into a family holiday. Why does District 1 produce career tributes while District 12 barely volunteers? What is the relationship between coal dust, hunger, and the decision to step forward for your sister? After that, we're going district by district in terms of function. Not a full tour, but enough to see how each one plugs into the machine. We'll trace how a luxury district's village would become a showroom of excess, while a place like 11 would turn its victors into living warnings. There is a lot to uncover here about how architecture, industry, and surveillance all braid together. Midway through, we pivot hard into political theory. Why would a regime choose ritualized child sacrifice over simpler, quieter repression? Why not just disappear dissidents in the night? We'll talk about spectacle, about why the capital needs the games economically and emotionally, and how the rebellion ends up mirroring that logic with its own propaganda, its own public executions, and Coin's symbolic final games proposal. And at the end, we're going speculative. We'll imagine what Victor's village would realistically look like in each district, then push further. What would a truly post-games Panem have to redesign, demolish, or ritualize differently to be anything other than Hunger Games 2.0? We'll close by asking whether Katniss and Peter are actually symbols of peace, or proof that any peace in Panem will always be built on scars that never fully heal. Welcome to Victor's Village, why this channel lives in the aftermath. So when we talk about after the games, we're never just talking about credits rolling and everyone going home. We're talking about the part of the story that most cameras in Panem never bothered to show. This channel lives there, in the ruins, in the quiet streets of Victor's village, in the space between what the capital promised and what it actually delivered. If you've been here before, you already know we're going to cover the parts of the Hunger Games that sit under the surface. The lore, the politics, the world-building choices that tell you more about Panem than any victory tour speech ever could. If you're new, here's the deal. This isn't a recap channel. At face value, yes, we walk through the games, the districts, the treaties, the rebellions. But here's the real question. What is the machinery behind all of that? Why did someone build a system where a victor gets a mansion and a phone line to the capital, but can't walk down their own street without being watched? This is where we talk about that machinery. We've already pulled apart Snow's whole relationship with the games, why he needs that annual bloodletting as a stabilizer, why the Treaty of Treason is basically the constitution of state-sponsored terror. We've broken down Coin too, and the moment she suggests a symbolic final games with capital children as tributes. That part matters because it proves the logic of sacrifice doesn't disappear when you swap presidents. It just changes targets. If you've watched the breakdowns on the quarter quells, you know those weren't improvisations, baked into the system decades in advance. The second quell drags in extra tributes by district. The third cannibalizes the existing pool of victors. So when we say this video builds on those, we mean it literally. Victor's Village is the architectural proof that Panem never planned for a world without the arena. But don't worry if this is your first watch. Everything here will still stand on its own. So if you're the kind of person who hears long-form, lore-heavy, slightly unhinged Hunger Games essay and thinks, yes, that's a reasonable way to spend an evening, you're in the right district. You can stick around, hit subscribe if you want more of this, and let the algorithm play escort to your next reaping of content, because there is a lot to uncover here. Victor's Village is not an afterthought, it's a blueprint, a promise of hope on a hill that keeps the rest of the district in place. And to understand why peace in Panem can't just be voted into existence, we have to walk back to the beginning and ask, what kind of nation designs its entire political architecture around a yearly child sacrifice? In the next section, we'll step into that origin story and trace how the games became structurally necessary for the capital's survival, and why tearing them down threatens the whole house. After the dark days, why the capital needed more than just fear. So after the dark days end and the smoke clears, you'd think the capital's next move would be simple. Execute the rebels, park some peacekeepers in every district, and call it a day. But here's the real question. How do you make that terror last for 100 years, not just a single terrified generation? Back then, the dark days are a full-scale civil war. 13 districts rise up. District 13 is wiped out, and the capital nearly loses the entire resource pipeline it depends on. The Treaty of Treason is their reset button. On paper, it restores order. In practice, it does something much colder. It legally codifies the Hunger Games as an annual punishment and a permanent reminder of what rebellion costs. One boy and one girl from each district. Every year. No exceptions. At face value, the capital could have stopped there with mass executions, public hangings, firing squads, permanent military occupation. That's cheaper than building arenas, right? But that part matters because fear, by itself, has an expiration date. Your grandparents remember the war. Your parents remember the executions. You remember stories. Unless the violence is ritualized, visible, and renewed, the edge dulls. The relationship between district and capital starts to drift from terror into resentment, and resentment is where rebellion grows back. So this is where we talk about the games as political architecture, not just a show, but a repeating structure the entire nation has to move through every year. Reaping Day, training scores, the anthem, the victor's tour. The capital turns punishment into a calendar. The war never really ends. It's reenacted on schedule. There is a lot to uncover here, because the design keeps the memory of defeat fresh without the capital having to constantly wage open war. And the capital isn't talking to just one audience. That's the dual problem. For the districts, the message is simple. Your children are disposable, and we own the right to prove it on live television. For capital citizens, the message has to be almost the opposite. Not you're next, but you're safe, you're special, and we're giving you a spectacle. The same event that traumatizes the districts has to entertain the capital, or the whole system starts to wobble. So why turn horror into entertainment? Why not keep the games grim and purely punitive? The reason is sustainability. You need capital viewers invested, betting on tributes, obsessing over potential victor romances, demanding higher production value. When cruelty becomes profitable, no one with power has an incentive to shut it off. And someone has to solve that design problem. How do you make a war crime feel normal? How do you turn state terror into a national pastime that still promises hope to exactly the right people. That's where a young Coriolanus Snow walks in, and the next evolution of the games begins. Snow's promotion from hungry student to architect of spectacle. So when Coriolanus Snow walks into the 10th Hunger Games, he's not the marble statue you're used to. He's hungry. He's broke. He's a scholarship kid in a crumbling penthouse, measuring his future in bowls of cabbage soup and extra rations from the academy. Back then, the games barely work. The arena is literally an old sports stadium. No high-tech force fields, no mutts. Half the capital doesn't even bother to watch. Why tune in when the tributes are dragged in filthy, starved and shoved in a zoo cage? They're prisoners, not celebrities. And that part matters because it means the system is failing at its main job, making terror feel normal. Here's the real question. If the games are supposed to be the capital's ultimate weapon, what happens when nobody cares? Why keep spending resources on a punishment that doesn't deliver ratings, fear, or even decent gossip? This is where we talk about Snow not as a cartoon villain, but as a terrified honors student staring down poverty and irrelevance. His assignment is simple at face value: mentor a tribute, Lucy Grey-Baird. But Snow immediately reframes it as product design. He leans into narrative. He sells her as a story. The snakes, the song, the rainbow dress, the charm offensive on the cameras. He's testing a theory. If you give the capital a reason to emotionally invest, the games suddenly become watchable. And it works. Viewership spikes. People start placing bets. The relationship between audience and tribute shifts from distant disgust to fascinated attachment. The games aren't just execution, they're entertainment with favorites, underdogs, and heartbreak. There is a lot to uncover here, because buried in that shift are the seeds of everything we're going to cover later. Sponsors, stylists, the promise of a victor's future. Snow watches how small incentives change behavior. A loaf of bread dropped into the arena, a prize for the top mentor, public praise from Dr. Gall. Each tiny reward teaches him the core rule of this system. If you want people to participate in their own oppression, you have to give them something to win, or at least the hope of it. That's where the blueprint for Victor's village starts, even if the houses don't exist yet. He sees that a surviving tribute can't just limp home. They need to return as a symbol that the games can pay off. A victor has to walk through their district as walking propaganda, proof that the capital can be generous, that the games might be your one escape from starvation. Snow's personal payoff is just as important. His innovations earn him scholarships, patronage, and eventually a path into political power. The capital doesn't promote him because he's cruel. They promote him because he makes cruelty profitable. He's a systems designer now, someone who understands why the games must evolve from raw punishment into a machine that manufactures desire. So once he's in charge, what do you build for your star survivors to keep that desire alive? A mansion, a village, a promise. And that's where we go next. Inventing Victor's village, Snow's beautiful cage. So once he's in charge, what do you build for your star survivors to keep that desire alive? A mansion, a village, a promise. But here's the real question. Why does Snow suddenly care about real estate in places he's already starving? You think back to the 10th Games. Back then, tributes are half feral, half starved, and completely uninterested in putting on a show. They don't know how to perform for cameras, they can't sell a romance, and they certainly don't make the capital feel glamorous for watching children die. So why the change after that? Why pivot from cages to cul-de-sacs? Snow's problem is simple. Punishment alone isn't sustainable. If the games are just terror, districts will do anything to end them. He needs tributes who are stronger, more charismatic, more willing to play along because there's something in it for them. Career districts solve part of that, but not enough. You want volunteers from everywhere. You need a visible prize. This is where we talk about Victor's Village as a design solution, not a gift. At face value, it's the capital being generous. Survive the arena and you never work again. Your family eats well, you get hot water, full power, appliances that actually function. In District 12, those 12 empty houses are the nicest structures anyone has ever seen. But that part matters because it turns survival into aspiration. You're not just escaping punishment, you're winning a lifestyle. And Snow makes sure everyone can see it. The village is always set apart, slightly elevated, close enough that every child can point to it, but far enough that they can't touch it. Every district now lives with this daily reminder, someone from here made it out. Even if that someone is dead, drunk, or broken, the architecture keeps repeating the same promise. It could be you. There is a lot to uncover here in how it functions as propaganda. Those houses are billboards. They say the games are fair, that every district has a shot, that the capital rewards loyalty and spectacle. We're going to cover how Victor's lives actually get worse later, but the facade is crucial. The village builds a local mythos. This is where winners live. This is where hope moves in. And none of it is charity. It's an investment portfolio made of people. The capital spends resources to create a tiny upper class inside each district. A class whose entire identity is tied to the games. You want food for your district? Mentor harder. You want your name on one of those doors? Train your children. The relationship between district and arena becomes transactional, even cooperative. Once you can get people to compete for that, you've solved Snow's biggest problem. You've made the game self-fueling. Victor's Village is the prototype for a world where the arena never has to end, because the dream of moving into those empty houses keeps resetting the cycle for the next generation. The psychology of a mansion, why the prize has to be public. So once you've built an entire future on the promise of those empty houses, you hit the next problem. Where do you put the people who actually win? Victor's Village answers that with architecture. In District 12, it's on a hill, tree-lined, fenced, slightly apart from town, but still in full view. At face value, that feels generous. Space, safety, electricity that actually works. But here's the real question. Why does the capital insist those mansions are both separate and impossible to ignore? That physical distance is doing psychological work. If you're a starving kid in the seam, you can see the big white houses through the smoke from the mines, but you can't touch them. They become a horizon line, close enough to dream about, far enough to remind you you're not there. For some, that's aspirational. For others, it's alienating. Proof that the victor is no longer quite one of us. The capital wins either way, because the district starts arguing over the relationship to the victor instead of the reason the games exist at all. This is where we talk about the feasts, the celebrations, the food parcels that rain down when your tribute does well. The moment a victor comes home, the whole district is dragged into the reward cycle. You didn't step into the arena, but you're still getting grain, oil, maybe meat for the first time in months. So how angry can you be at a system that just fed your children? That part matters because it turns state violence into a community party. You're not just watching the games, you're eating them. For the victor, the trap is even tighter. Every room in that mansion is evidence you're one of the lucky ones. Hot water, closets of capital clothes, pantries that never empty. When you've grown up on Tesserae, how do you publicly reject that without sounding ungrateful to the people still in the shacks below? Haymitch's rotting house in the books is so powerful here. It's him trying to sabotage the stage. But the stage is still there, and it is a stage. The capital doesn't just give you a mansion, it turns your front door into a permanent set. Victory tours start and end there. Cameras roll when you mentor. Reporters descend whenever Snow needs a quote. You're paraded, interviewed, dressed up for the annual recap, constantly reminded that your only real value is how watchable you are. We're going to cover how those talents and media roles extend that, but the mansion is the anchor point. All of this feeds Snow's larger goal, to shift the games from something people survive to something they might actually volunteer for. If the reward is private, the hope is small. If the reward is a glowing mansion on a hill, the hope is public, contagious, inheritable. The real horror is what happens when that staged hope starts to crack on camera, and Snow has to decide whether to fix the set or burn it down. From starving kids to career tributes, volunteering is a feature, not a bug. So once the set is built and glowing on that hill, what happens when the kids stop needing to be pushed? What happens when they start stepping forward on their own? Back in the early games, tributes are pure victims. Names pulled from a bowl, bodies marched to the train. Parents screaming in the square. No one is training their 8-year-old with spears. No one is framing the arena as a career path. The horror is blunt. The capital takes your children and you watch them die. So why the shift from that raw terror to Districts 1, 2, and 4 raising what are literally called career tributes? This is where we talk about volunteering as a feature, not a glitch in the system. At face value, volunteering looks like a tiny mercy. Someone stronger can take your place. A sibling can step in. A trained fighter can spare a weaker child. But here's the real question. Why would Snow allow that kind of escape clause unless it served him? There is a lot to uncover here. First, volunteering creates the illusion of choice. If the tribute steps forward, it muddies the relationship between victim and executioner. Did the capital kill them, or did they choose glory? In the career districts, that question gets answered for you. Children are groomed in special academies, fed better, praised for their potential. The reaping becomes a stage for ambition instead of mourning. That part matters because it shifts the story from "we are being sacrificed" to "we are competing." And once you introduce Victor's village into that ecosystem, the choice starts to look rational. Win, and your family never worries about food again. Win, and your whole district gets celebrations and extra grain. Win, and you move into that mansion you've been staring at your whole childhood. The promise isn't just safety from the games, it's exemption from the mines, the factories, the nets. In that context, Volunteering doesn't read as suicidal, it reads as noble, even responsible. Now zoom out to the cameras. A terrified, untrained 12-year-old stumbling through the woods makes for tragedy. A confident, charismatic career tribute showing off in training makes for television. The more the districts buy into training, the more polished the tributes become, the better the show, the higher the ratings. The games evolve from a public execution into a national sport with sponsors, favorites, and meta-commentary. You're not just watching punishment anymore, you're watching celebrities being manufactured in real time. Here's the pattern interrupt. Once you've built a culture where kids dream of volunteering, how do you ever turn that off? How do you convince a district that has invested decades of resources into training careers to suddenly stop when their entire local status system is built around potential victors? And that loops us back to why the games become almost impossible to dismantle peacefully. The Capitol isn't just enforcing violence from the top down, it's engineered districts to uphold that violence from the bottom up. Parents push training because it might be their child's only ticket out. Mentors groom new tributes because their own survival depends on staying useful. Victors, trapped in the village, are forced to sell the very dream that broke them. So when a rebellion finally comes, you're not just asking people to overthrow a government, you're asking them to walk away from an entire logic of survival, status, and hope that has been baked into their childhoods. And the next question is brutal. What do you replace that logic with when every tool anyone trusts is another version of the arena? District 12, the district that refused to play until it didn't. So if every tool anyone trusts is another version of the arena, what happens in a district that refuses to pick up the tool at all? On paper, that should be District 12. No career academies, no training, no proud parades of volunteers. At face value, 12 is the control group. This is where we talk about the district that wants nothing to do with the games. Reaping Day there isn't a pageant, it's a weather event. It rolls in once a year, everyone braces, and then you count who's missing afterward. No one's practicing swordplay in the schoolyard. They're practicing not drawing attention, not standing out, not giving the Capitol any extra reason to remember their names. But here's the real question. Does refusing to volunteer actually weaken the game's hold on you, or does it just strip away the glitter so you can see the trauma more clearly? In 12, there's no illusion of choice. You don't chase the promise of becoming a victor, you dodge the probability of becoming a corpse. Tesserae makes it worse. Hunger literally pushes children to stack their names in the bowl, so even the act of opting out of career culture is still a relationship with the game's economic logic. That part matters because Katniss doesn't grow up dreaming of glory. She grows up calculating odds. When she says the word reaping, you feel the math behind it. And then she does the one thing District 12 supposedly never does. She volunteers. A teenager steps forward, shouts her name, claims the spot. But the reason is inverted. Katniss isn't chasing fame. She's intercepting a death sentence aimed at a 12-year-old. It's not ambition, it's triage. That single decision cracks open the Capitol's script. A volunteer motivated by love, not status, exposes how artificial the usual volunteering narrative really is. So how does the Capitol read that moment? At first, they think they've struck narrative gold. Here's a grim, coal-dust volunteer from the dead-end district, sacrificing herself for her sister. Perfect for ratings. Perfect for hope. You can almost hear the producers rewriting her into a new kind of star. The selfless victor who proves the games are a stage for noble sacrifice, not just brutality. But there is a lot to uncover here, because once Katniss keeps refusing to play by their emotional rules, favoring Peter, mourning Rue, threatening double suicide, the Capitol realizes the motive they tried to glamorize is actually contagious. If people start volunteering out of love instead of greed, the whole punishment logic wobbles. Why are you killing the girl who would do anything to protect a child? District 12 proves something uncomfortable. Even when a district opts out of the career system, it's still fully trapped. The coal economy depends on capital demand, the food supply depends on tesserae, the emotional calendar orbits the arena. There is no outside. And once someone from that non-volunteering district breaks the rule on their own terms, you can't just put the logic back in the box. So the next question is brutal in a different way. What happens when the district that never wanted to play becomes the one that teaches everyone else how to stop? The volunteer the system wasn't built for. So when District 12, the place where volunteering is basically a myth, suddenly produces a volunteer, the entire board shifts. Not just any volunteer either. Someone who isn't playing for glory, or sponsors, or even that mansion on the hill. She's playing for her sister. This is where we talk about Katniss Everdeen as a glitch the system never coded for. Career districts produce volunteers who treat the games as a career fair. You train, you step forward, you win, you move into Victor's village, you become living proof that the Capitol's promise works. But Katniss, she doesn't care about the title of Victor. She barely looks at Victor's village when it's first mentioned. At face value, she's accepting the same deal. In reality, she's rejecting the entire relationship the Capitol is trying to sell. Why is that such a problem? Because her motive is incompatible with their script. The careers seek fame and comfort. Katniss is driven by protective love and years of hunting to keep her family alive. That part matters because it makes her both competent and disloyal. She's deadly with a bow. She understands tracking, camouflage, hunger, but she has zero ideological investment in the games as a path to a better life. The arena is just another hostile wilderness to survive and escape, not a stage to win. So the Capitol does what it always does with a problem. It tries to turn her into content. Cinna sets her on fire. The stylists brand her the girl on fire. Snow and the game makers push the star-crossed lovers narrative with Peter. We're going to cover how that romance becomes its own weapon later. But here's the real question right now. Why do they need her to be in love, not angry? Because a love story is safe hope. A grieving, principled survivor is dangerous hope. Katniss keeps slipping. She threatens the game makers with the pig. She honors Rue with flowers, forcing the cameras to linger on grief instead of spectacle. She pulls out the berries and turns a neat Victor's ending into a public hostage situation. Every time the Capitol thinks it has her framed in a shot, she steps out of it, and then she actually wins. She moves into Victor's village, technically fulfilling the dream every district child has been forced to watch for 74 years. Only now the prize looks wrong. Prim's nightmares echo in a house that's too big. Her mother drifts through spotless rooms that feel more like a museum than a home. Haymitch's decayed house down the street shows you what long-term victory really looks like. The village turns into a haunted house of Capitol promises. Full pantries, empty souls. Here's the real question. What happens when the symbol of reward is visibly traumatized? Katniss walks those perfect streets remembering every death that paid for her hot water and electricity. She doesn't forgive the system, she studies it. People like her don't become satisfied customers of the games, they become witnesses. And a system built on annual amnesia cannot survive too many witnesses. So when the Capitol decides what to do with its problematic new victor, the choice they make next proves exactly why the games were never designed to end peacefully. The invisible middle, what we don't see in Districts 5, 6, 9, and 10. Katniss becomes a witness. But a witness to what exactly? To District 12? To the Capitol? Or to a Panem we barely see at all? Here's the real question. When we talk about why the games can't end peacefully, whose Panem are we even talking about? We mostly live inside the heads of District 12. We glimpse the rage of 11, and we hear legends about the career districts. That narrow point of view is powerful, but it's also a filter. It can trick you into thinking there are only 3 ways to relate to the games: desperate fear, open hatred, or gleeful career culture. This is where we talk about the invisible middle. Districts 5, 6, 9, 10. They're on every map, on every betting screen, but almost never at the center of the story. At face value, they're just names attached to power, transportation, grain, and livestock. But there is a lot to uncover here because the system doesn't survive on just extremes. It survives on gradients. Think about Cedar from 11 and Blight from 7. We don't see their backstories, but we see enough to infer a pattern. They're not polished careers, yet they're competent, respected, clearly used to hard training through work rather than academies. So what happens in a district that isn't starving like 12, but also isn't grooming children full-time for the arena? Do they quietly encourage strong kids to enter local wrestling matches, archery clubs, work crews with the most dangerous jobs, all so they'll be a little less helpless if reaped? You can imagine a semi-career culture, not open recruiting with uniforms and parades, but unspoken rules. If your family has a history of victors, or your cousin almost made it to the final 8, there's pressure. Maybe you don't volunteer, you just happen to train. You just happen to know how to handle a spear because you work slaughtering livestock in 10, or how to climb and rig in 5 because you maintain power lines. That part matters because the Capitol doesn't need every district to worship the games. It just needs most of them to cooperate with a minimum of friction. Economic roles become ready-made excuses. District 5 can tell itself the games keep the power flowing by keeping the Capitol happy. District 6 might rationalize that the trains run, the medicine moves, because they don't rock the boat. Grain and livestock districts can literally watch their tribute deaths framed as the harvest that prevents another dark days. Here's the pattern interrupt. In that world, Victor's village doesn't even have to look glamorous to work. In a mid-tier district, it might just be a slightly nicer row of houses, a little more meat, a generator that never fails. The promise is smaller, but the psychology is the same. You see that one family that never worries about tesserae, and you think, maybe if our tribute trains just a bit harder. And this patchwork is precisely why the games can't unwind cleanly. There isn't one unified resistance culture for Snow to negotiate with. There's a dozen different coping strategies. Some districts hate the games, some try to game them, Some try not to think about them at all. Any peace deal has to confront not just the capital, but every local relationship to the arena, which means when the games finally crack, they don't dissolve into calm. They shatter along all those fault lines, and the capital is ready to weaponize every single one in what comes next. Career districts, when the games become your national sport, and once you see those fault lines, you have to ask, which districts does the capital bet on to hold the line? Not the ones who hate the games, the ones who celebrate them. This is where we talk about the career districts. Districts 1, 2, and 4 don't just send tributes, they raise them. Career tributes are kids who grow up training for the arena as if it's their national sport, volunteering at the reaping because dying on camera is framed as honor. At face value, it's patriotic. You're not being punished, you're representing your district. But here's the real question. Why would any parent buy into that? Because in those districts, the incentive structure actually makes sense. Or at least, it looks like it does. You have informal training academies, weapons practice, combat drills that everyone pretends are just physical education. The capital turns a legal restriction, no open military, into a loophole. You can train as long as it's for the games. That part matters because it gives these districts a head start and a reason to feel superior. You see it most clearly in District 2. They already have peacekeeper ties, stone quarries, a culture of discipline. Add sanctioned weapons training, and suddenly the arena feels less like a death sentence and more like a proving ground. District 1 gets luxury, presentation, sponsor appeal. District 4 gets water skills, nets, tridents. Each one gets a lane where their kids can plausibly win. And winning is everything. We're going to cover how Victor's village functions overall, but in the career districts, it's basically a hall of fame. Every marble house is a trophy case you can walk past on your way to school. The victors aren't distant legends, they're local celebrities, coaches, sometimes even family. You grow up watching the mentor, watching the capital cameras return to your streets every year. How do you argue with a system that's already handed your neighbor a mansion? So the games become a ladder. In poorer families, even in these better-off districts, having a child train as a career tribute can feel rational. If they win, your whole lineage is elevated. No more quarry, no more fishing boat. Food, status, protection from future reapings. The capital doesn't just weaponize fear here, it weaponizes hope. There is a lot to uncover here, because this cultural normalization makes the games self-perpetuating. Kids beg to be enrolled in training. Parents brag about their children's kill scores. The arena isn't an aberration. It's the pinnacle of the local value system. So why would these districts ever vote to end the thing that gives them prestige? And that's the tragedy. The districts most loyal to the capital's promise are also the ones whose children are most likely to die proving that loyalty. Every year, more careers go in, confident and prepared, and most still come home in a box. The system feeds on its strongest believers, which means when rebellion finally comes, those model districts aren't just allies or enemies, they're the capital's most tragic success story and its most dangerous battlefield. Inequality as design. Why the games need both careers and losers. And here's where the games get even crueler. Those model districts, don't just produce the most loyal tributes, they also produce the clearest contrast. You watch a career from 1 or 2 step off the train, polished, muscular, confident, already in a relationship with the arena. Then you see a tribute from 11 or 12 right after them. Smaller, thinner, eyes already calculating how fast they'll die. That visual gap is not an accident. At face value, it looks simple. Some districts train, some don't. May the best tribute win. But here's the real question. Why would a regime obsessed with control allow such an obvious imbalance in the first place? If Snow just wanted fair punishment, he could standardize training, control nutrition, flatten the odds. He doesn't. The capital needs the inequality, because inequality gives you story. This is where we talk about the edit. The career pack becomes the obvious villains on screen, laughing over supplies, spearing weaker kids, throwing spears for fun. The underfed tributes are handed the underdog arc, shaky hands, tearful goodbyes, that one mentor begging them to remember which end of the knife to hold. There is a lot to uncover here, because those narratives are doing political work. If you're in District 11 watching Rue stalk through the trees, you're not just scared of the capital, you're furious at District 1. If you're in 2, you're rolling your eyes at whiny seam kids who didn't train. Poor districts resent career districts for hoarding the good odds. Career districts resent poor districts for wasting their shots. The real enemy is orchestrating the whole thing, but the hate flows sideways, not up. That part matters because sideways hate is safe for the capital. Even Victor's village is calibrated to keep that division alive. In a career district, the village feels earned. It's an extension of the training center culture. Wide streets, trophies in windows, kids walking past and thinking, that could be me if I volunteer and win. The promise of comfort keeps the pipeline full. In a place like 12, the same architecture turns haunted. You have empty houses, overgrown gardens, Hamitch's decayed porch, Katniss pacing in a kitchen with full power, while the rest of the district works in the dark. Children see the wealth, but they can't touch it. It doesn't feel aspirational, it feels accusatory. And yet in both cases, the function is identical. Keep the victor separate. Keep the games visible. Keep the hierarchy physical. You don't just watch inequality on television. You walk past it on your way to the mines or the quarry. So when we talk about ending the games peacefully, we're going to cover something bigger than arenas and mutts. You'd have to dismantle the entire economic map that makes some kids' careers and other kids' cannon fodder. You'd have to rewrite who grows food, who makes weapons, who gets full bellies, and who signs up for Tesserae. Because as long as Panem runs on that imbalance, you can shut down one arena and the system will just build another stage. The real question is, what happens when someone finally refuses to play either role? Why allow volunteers at all? The question that breaks the capital's logic. The real question is, what happens when someone finally refuses to play either role? Because once you ask that, another question pops up that the story never answers directly. If the games are supposed to be pure punishment, pure control, why does the capital let anyone volunteer at all? Why is there even a gap in the system where Katniss can shout, "I volunteer," and rewrite a death sentence? At face value, that seems generous. The district gets to send its strongest, its most prepared, maybe even its most willing. But if you're President Snow designing a perfect terror machine, why would you ever allow that? Why not make it brutally simple? 2 names are drawn, those 2 children go. No substitutions, no bargaining, no heroic siblings stepping in. Imagine that version of Panem. The reaping stage becomes a conveyor belt. No drama of hands shooting up, no clamor in the crowd, no career tributes jostling for the honor. Just names, screams, peacekeepers. Done. It would maximize helplessness. Everyone would know in their bones that there is literally nothing you can do. So why doesn't Snow do that? He's not stupid. He's not sentimental. The Treaty of Treason is on his side. If volunteering exists, it's because it serves a purpose that's bigger than cruelty. And this is where we talk about power that wants to last longer than a single broadcast. Volunteering turns a rigged execution into a story about choice. It creates the illusion that the district participates in the games, that there's a relationship between what you do and what happens to you. You didn't just get taken, you stepped up. Your parents let you train. Your mayor encouraged the careers. That part matters because it shifts the narrative from pure victimhood to something that looks disturbingly close to agency. Here's the real question. Which is easier to live with year after year? Being prey in a system you can't touch, or believing on some level that you could have trained harder, volunteered smarter, produced a better victor? For the capital audience, volunteering adds strategy, drama, the promise that the best will rise. For the districts, it adds just enough hope that maybe next year your tribute will be that one kid who makes it home. There is a lot to uncover here, because once you see that, you realize Snow is doing political theory, not just sadism. He understands that a regime built only on fear burns out. People with nothing left to lose don't keep working in factories and fields. They burn them. So he doses the terror with a tiny measure of choice. So what's more powerful for a dictator? Fear alone, or fear laced with just enough hope to keep you moving toward the next reaping, the next train, the next arena? In the next section, we're going to cover how that little hope becomes the capital's favorite weapon, and why, once it cracks, the games can't end in peace at all. Hope versus fear, the one sentence that explains the games. Snow answers that question for us in one of the quietest, creepiest scenes in the series. He tells Seneca Crane, almost gently, hope is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. At face value, that sounds almost inspirational. You could slap it on a motivational poster and ignore that it's coming from a man who poisons people for a living. But here's the real question. What does a little hope actually look like when you turn it into state policy? This is where we talk about the games as a machine that doesn't just kill tributes, it calibrates emotions across an entire country. Fear is the easy part. Anyone can be reaped. Every child in every district grows up knowing their name might come out of that glass bowl, no matter how careful their family is. That terror is universal, and the capital makes sure it stays that way, with mandatory viewing, victory tours, and the Treaty of Treason hanging over everything as the legal promise that the games will return every single year. But fear alone burns too hot. People snap, they riot, they stop working. So Snow threads in that tiny weaponized hope. Someone can win. Not an abstract someone, but your someone. Your district's face on the screen, your colors in the arena, your anthem playing when a cannon doesn't fire for once. There is a lot to uncover here about how that shifts the relationship between the districts and the games. Victor's village is the physical embodiment of that little hope. It's not just a prize, it's a billboard you have to walk past on your way to the mines or the fields. Those mansions on the hill in District 12, full power, hot water, pantries that never run out. Tangible enough that a hungry kid can picture themselves there. Rare enough that almost no one ever will. That part matters because it keeps the promise just out of reach. You can see the curtains. You can't touch the doorknob. Compare that to simple mass executions. If the capital just lined people up and shot them, the story ends right there. You grieve, you rage, and then nothing. The narrative is over. The games do the opposite. They spin every death into an episode, every injury into a subplot. You're not just watching your children die, you're following arcs, ships, rivalries. You root for your tribute to get a sponsor gift, to make an alliance, to stand in that Snow White mansion someday. And as long as the system depends on that balance, terror that anyone can be taken, hope that someone might escape into luxury, the games aren't just tradition, they're infrastructure. You can't simply turn them off without replacing them with something equally potent, some new spectacle or threat that keeps the capital fed and the districts in line. So when people talk about ending the games peacefully, they're really asking, what happens to a regime built on televised sacrifice when the cameras go dark? In the next section, we're going to cover how Victor's village turns that little hope into a lifelong sentence, and why the victors themselves become the capital's most dangerous loose ends. The arena as a power plant, how the games feed the capital. So if Victor's village is how the games keep the entire country on payroll, you're told it's a punishment, a reminder of the dark days. At face value, it's state-sanctioned murder with good lighting. But here's the real question. What happens when that punishment turns into the single biggest annual production the capital has ever seen? This is where we talk about the arena as a power plant. Not for electricity, for jobs, status, and money. Every year, an entire industry spins up around the games. Game makers, imitation labs, stylists, costume designers, makeup teams, trainers, peacekeepers, escort staff, broadcasters, tech crews, hovercraft pilots, even the people who design the chariots for the opening ceremony. You're not just watching a death match, you're watching the capital's version of a full employment program. Think about Caesar Flickerman's show, the interviews, the commentary, the endless analysis of each tribute's odds. That means writers, producers, camera operators, editors, sponsors. The games aren't one event. They're a months-long media season. There is a lot to uncover here, because once an economy wraps itself around a spectacle, ending the spectacle threatens everyone who feeds off it. And then you add sponsorships and betting. We see sponsors sending gifts into the arena. But that part matters because it implies a whole financial system off-screen. Capital citizens purchasing sponsor packages, gambling on which district's tribute will last longer, paying premiums to influence the arena in real time. The games become a casino that always pays the house. Can you peacefully cancel the thing that funds half the capital's leisure class? The capital justifies its luxury as a reward for maintaining order and hosting the games. That's the promise. We keep the districts in line, we stage the show, and in return we get the good food, the tech, the fashion. The relationship between cruelty and comfort is made explicit. Why does Snow need the parades, the feasts, the victory tour? Because they visually convert district suffering into capital wealth. It's propaganda, but it's also a receipt. And the districts are pulled in economically too. You need extra food for the victory tour banquets. District 11 and 9 ramp up production. New high-tech arenas. District 3 builds the systems, weapons, armor, peacekeeper gear. District 2 gets the contracts, textiles for costumes, flags, banners. District 8. Even District 12's coal once fueled the trains and power that keep the broadcasts running. Every game's season, somewhere, a factory whistle blows longer. So when you end the games, you're not just making a moral choice, you're triggering an economic shock. Entire capital factions, game makers, sponsors, fashion houses, broadcasters, peacekeeper commanders stand to lose their livelihoods and their status overnight. Why would they ever vote for peace when war is their business model? And here's the uncomfortable twist. When the rebellion wins, they inherit that empty power plant, all that infrastructure, all those workers. So the next question is, what do you do with a system built to produce death when you suddenly promise hope instead? In the next section, we're going to cover how that little hope gets repackaged after the war, and why Coin's proposal for a final games proves the arena was never just a place. It was an economy waiting to be restarted. The village next door, how victors reshape their districts. So you tear down the arenas, you burn the uniforms, you swear the Hunger Games are over. But then you walk past the edge of town, and there it is, a perfect little suburb. This is where we talk about the village next door. In District 12, it's houses with glass windows and working plumbing sitting on a hill above miners' shacks and blackened chimneys. In 11, you can imagine white porches overlooking fields where pickers still sleep 3 to a room. The contrast is brutal. A gleaming row of homes, full power, full pantries, framed by crumbling worker housing and exhausted labor. You don't need a history book. The architecture tells you who survived the games. At face value, Victor's Village is a reward. Win, and your family never starves again. Your district gets extra food, music, a parade. For one night, the mines or the orchards or the textile mills slow down and everyone pretends the system is generous. But here's the real question. What happens the morning after the party? The answer is, nothing changes that actually matters. The quotas stay. The peacekeepers stay. The treaty of treason doesn't go away because someone from your district managed to outlive 23 other children on camera. The short-term high of full bellies and fireworks just papers over the long-term exploitation. That part matters because it trains you to associate the games with relief, not with the structure that made the games necessary in the first place. And the victor themselves, they don't just get a house. They become a local power center. Suddenly, there's someone in your district who has a direct phone line to the capital, who can request medicine, who can pull strings to save a cousin from a whipping, or get an extra shipment of grain. Hamish, Finnick, Johanna, each of them is both a celebrity and a resource hub. But all of that influence is conditional. You only keep it if you keep playing along. We're going to cover the capital side of that relationship more later, but the basic deal is simple. You want those favors to keep flowing. You smile on camera, you mentor tributes, you sell the story that victory is worth it. Even if mentoring means sending kids you train to their deaths, even if the capital is also selling your body, your trauma, your image, here's the pattern interrupt. This doesn't just control victors. Instead of hoping the games end, you're pushed to hope that your tribute wins, that your district gets the feast, the extra rations, the one person in Victor's village who can occasionally bend the rules. Snow talks about a little hope being useful. This is the upgraded version. Hope, but on their terms. And once your survival is tied to that hope, you're structurally incentivized to keep participating. Even districts that hate the games still send their children, still watch, still cheer at the end, because not participating means giving up your only legal path to relief. That's the trap. The village next door isn't just a reminder of past violence, it's a standing promise that the next round of violence might, maybe, work in your favor. So when someone finally suggests ending the games for good, you're not just fighting fear or morality, you're fighting the entire local economy of hope your district has been forced to build around one hilltop street. In the next section, we'll pull back out again and ask, if every community is built around that bargain, how do you dismantle the games without collapsing everything that's grown up around them? The Gilded Cage, day-to-day life inside Victor's village. So you've built an entire district economy around that one glittering street on the hill. Now what actually happens on that street when the cameras go home? At face value, Victor's village looks peaceful. Wide empty roads, identical mansions, power that never flickers while the rest of the district freezes. But walk through it in your head for a day and it stops feeling rich and starts feeling wrong. No kids playing, no markets. 12 houses maybe, and in most districts only 1 or 2 ever filled. Every bedroom is a graveyard of nightmares. You wake up in a bed big enough for a family of 6. You're alone. The capital installed cameras when you moved in. They say it's for your security, but whose safety are they really protecting? Snow needs to know where his victors are at all times, so the doorbell isn't neighbors dropping by, it's stylists, prep teams, capital reporters, old friends with new contracts. This is where we talk about the daily rerun of the games, because your new job as a victor isn't to heal, it's to mentor. Every single year, you get a front row seat to your own trauma. You train 2 terrified kids, you send them in, and the entire district watches you pretend you're helping. Here's the real question. How do you ever convince yourself you're not just a capital employee now? Haymitch answers that with a bottle. His house in District 12 is filthy. Decayed, the only thing in the village that actually reflects what's going on inside a victor's head. Katniss answers it with isolation, hiding in empty houses when the fence goes live, filling the silence with plant books and hunting trips because she can't fill it with people. Peter tries domesticity, baking, painting the arena on his walls, as if naming the horror might contain it. Then you have Finnick. On screen, we mostly see the charm, the nets, the trident, the smiles. In the books, that part matters because the charm is armor. The capital sells him as a sex symbol, and Snow sells access to him as a reward. That's not a rumor, it's systemic sexual coercion. Johanna refuses to play that role, so they take everything else from her instead. Her sarcasm and bitterness aren't personality quirks. They're what's left when you've been tortured for saying no. There is a lot to uncover here about the relationship between reward and punishment. The capital uses blackmail, threats against families, and the promise of further games to keep victors obedient. You want your loved ones safe? Smile for the cameras, mentor the next batch, go on tour, sleep with who we tell you to. The mansion is collateral, not a gift. So why build all this just to turn it into a prison with better wallpaper? Because to Snow, every victor is a living weapon. Victor's Village isn't a retirement plan. It's a long-term holding facility, a place to store, surveil, and deploy symbols on demand. And if your weapons start dreaming about peace instead of performance, the capital has a contingency for that too. In the next section, we're going to cover what happens when that contingency kicks in and the arena itself comes looking for the people who were promised they'd escaped it forever. Book versus movie. Why Victor's Village feels so much emptier on screen. So when the arena comes looking for victors, it doesn't always show up with force fields and mutts. Sometimes it shows up as a cul-de-sac. In the books, Victor's Village in District 12 is almost mundane at face value. A neat row of 12 houses set apart on the hill, with only a few actually lived in. You walk through it and feel that eerie sense of abandonment. Doors shut, curtains drawn, power on, but no one home. It's not luxury so much as wasted potential. All those empty houses are a census of the dead. Every unclaimed porch is another year the games did their job. But here's the real question. Why does the movie version feel even emptier when there's technically less detail? On the page, you get Katniss noting appliances, hot water, cabinets full of food, Haymitch's place decaying under bottles and vomit. There is a lot to uncover here in terms of how she keeps tripping over signs of life. On screen, the production design strips that down. Clean, symmetrical streets, identical facades, white trim, perfectly raked snow or gravel. The camera pulls back and just holds. No music, no chatter, just space. That part matters because film can weaponize silence in a way prose can't. When we see only 3 occupied houses in a perfectly planned neighborhood, it stops reading as a reward and starts reading as a mausoleum. The symmetry turns sinister. You're not seeing where victors live, you're seeing where victors should have lived if more children had succeeded. The capital's promise is literally built into the architecture. 12 slots, 12 chances, 12 ways to remind the district that the games are supposed to go on forever. And notice how the movies emphasize isolation. In the books, Katniss wanders into an empty house to hide when the fence is electrified. The village is a place she can move through, test, even temporarily claim. In the films, the wide shots dwarf her. She's a speck on a frozen street. When Peter comes home, when Snow's white roses appear, it feels less like neighbors visiting and more like ghosts intruding on a graveyard. We're going to cover how this visual language reinforces the idea that the games don't end. They just relocate into a quieter, more psychologically invasive setting where every window is an implied camera. So if this is what District 12's suburb looks and feels like, what about the others? You can almost map each district's relationship to the games by imagining its village. In 1 and 2, maybe the houses are actually full, trophies in the windows, kids playing training arena in the street, because being a victor is an aspirational career. In 11, you might picture wider gaps, more empty lots, guards at the entrance, a harsher contrast between plantation fields and pristine lawns. The reason this thought experiment works is that the capital needs each village to say the same thing in a different accent. This could be you, if you survive what kills everyone else. And that raises a darker question. If every district has its own graveyard of almost victors, what happens when the capital decides to dig those graves back up? Designing the villages. How each district's prize reveals its wounds. So if every district has its own graveyard of almost victors, what does the capital build on top of those ghosts? Houses. But not the same house copy-pasted 12 times. This is where we talk about design as propaganda. Because at face value, Victor's Village is just a reward. A mansion, some gardens, a little distance from the noise. But here's the real question. How do you make the same threat and the same promise feel custom-made for each district? Take District 1. You can probably see it instantly. Gleaming stone, jewel-toned glass, fountains that serve no functional purpose except to whisper, "You were better than them." Their village doesn't clash with the diamond storefronts and perfume displays. It completes them. The games are the final runway show, and the victor is the model who never has to step off stage. That part matters because the relationship between one and the games is already aspirational. You don't have to convince children to want this. You just have to hang the prize in the same window as everything else they've been taught to desire. Now jump to District 11 and feel the whiplash. You still get the manicured lawns and bigger houses, but notice what changes. The fences, the watchtowers, the peacekeepers. The village there almost can't relax. Historically, 11 is punished hard. It riots. It remembers Rue. So you imagine a victor's village where celebrations are mandatory but tight-lipped, where every harvest worker can see the mansion on the hill and also the rifle on the balcony. Is that really a reward, or is it a pressure cooker with nicer curtains? District 4 shifts the mood again. Seaside mansions, open balconies, nets drying on polished railings. The ocean breeze sells the fantasy that you've finally escaped the storm. But then look at District 2. Same wealth, opposite feeling. Fortress-like villas carved into rock, reinforced doors, training yards visible from the street. Their village doesn't hide the militarized culture. It advertises it. You're not just a victor, you're an asset. A weapon the capital can call directly. There is a lot to uncover here about why those two districts, both close to the capital, get comfort packaged with duty. And then you hit the mid-tier districts, the 5S, 6S, 7S. Their villages feel almost empty. 12 houses built, one porch light on, maybe two spaced decades apart. You grow up walking past this half-finished suburb of ghosts, and the message is twisted. You could have this, theoretically, but history says you probably won't. So is that hope, or statistical cruelty dressed in stucco? Here's the pattern interrupt. The architecture changes, but the script doesn't. Whether it's jewel boxes, guard posts, beach estates, or stone bunkers, every victor's village is a local billboard screaming the same line. The games work. They bring order. They bring food. They bring the only visible path out. So what happens when the capital starts losing control of its own billboards? Quarter quells. Proof the cruelty was preloaded. So what happens when the capital starts losing control of its own billboards? You don't redesign the posters, you rewrite the script underneath them. This is where we talk about the quarter quells. At face value, the quells are framed as solemn anniversaries. Every 25 years, there's a special Hunger Games to commemorate some aspect of the Dark Days and remind the districts why rebellion was a mistake. But here's the real question. Why are those twists written down decades in advance, sealed in a locked box long before Snow is even in power? There is a lot to uncover here. The official story is that each quell honors the history of Panem. In reality, it tells you the capital wasn't just punishing a past rebellion, it was pre-gaming the next one. The Treaty of Treason doesn't only legalize the games, it bakes escalation into the operating system. Look at the second quarter quell. Double the tributes. 4 children from every district instead of 2. On paper, it reminds people that the districts were responsible for the war and must pay a greater price. But what's the actual function? You normalize the idea that when control slips, the answer isn't negotiation, it's more blood. You teach every child watching that the games can always get worse. Then you hit the third quarter quell and the mask just falls off. Reaping from the existing pool of victors is sold as a way to remind the districts that even their heroes are accountable. But the real target is hope itself. Victors are the closest thing the districts have to living proof that the system can be beaten. So the capital turns that promise inside out. Win once, and you're not retired. You're reloaded. Remember, these twists weren't improvised responses to Katniss. They were pre-scripted long before she was born. That part matters because it means the capital always anticipated that victors might become dangerous symbols. The solution wasn't reform, it was a built-in kill switch. If a district starts rallying around its champions, you already have a legal, televised mechanism to throw those champions back into the arena and break them on camera. And this is where Victor's village becomes a trap instead of a prize. The third quell turns every village into a hunting ground. The reaping pool is no longer the whole district. It's the handful of people who were promised safety. Your mansion on the hill? It just became the easiest place for the capital to find you when they need a new show. So what kind of system plans, in advance, to cannibalize its own heroes? Not one that's preparing to quietly phase out the games. A structure with preloaded quells is a structure designed for self-defense. It assumes resistance, it scripts the crackdown, and it rehearses the broadcast. Once your justice system is literally an arena with scheduled upgrades in cruelty, where does peaceful retirement even fit? It doesn't. And that raises an even darker question. If the capital built all these safeguards into the games, what happens when a rebellion wins and inherits that playbook? Victors as weapons. Why you can't build peace out of people trained to kill. So when a rebellion wins and inherits that playbook, what do they actually inherit? They don't just get the laws or the arenas, they get the people the game's already forged into weapons. This is where we talk about the victors. At face value, Finnick, Johanna, Beatty, Enobaria, even Haymitch look like the perfect assets for a new regime. They're famous, they're proven survivors, entire districts already know their faces. If you're trying to sell a revolution to a traumatized population, who better to front your propaganda than the people who beat the capital at its own game? But here's the real question. What does it do to a society when its moral authority is built on people whose claim to fame is state-sanctioned murder? Snow understands the answer perfectly. That part matters because we see him repurpose Finnick as a sexual commodity, Johanna as a torture target, Beatty as a weapons engineer. Each victor becomes a specialized tool: seduction, fear, technology. The capital doesn't retire them, it just changes the arena. And when the rebellion rises, Coin does the exact same thing. Finnick is redeployed as the charming face of anti-capital broadcasts. Beatty designs hacking strategies and weapons. Joanna is trained for combat missions. The uniforms change. The job description really doesn't. There is a lot to uncover here about trauma. Hypervigilance keeps you alive in the games. In a council chamber, it turns every disagreement into a potential threat. Aggression is adaptive when you're facing mutts. In peacetime politics, it looks like intimidation, purges, revenge. Dissociation helps Katniss and the others survive horror. Put that same coping mechanism in a president or a judge, and you get leaders who can emotionally detach from the people they're harming. So how do you build a justice system out of that? How do you design courts, laws, or a culture of non-violence when your most visible citizens are literally walking reminders that the system once rewarded killing children with mansions and sponsorship deals? We're going to cover the rebellion's dependency here because it's crucial. Districts don't just trust Coin on principle, they trust the Mockingjay, they trust the victors who stand beside her. The rebellion needs their combat power and their symbolic power. Without Katniss, Finnick, Johanna and the rest, it's just another distant capital asking for sacrifice. With them, it can promise hope. But that hope is inseparable from the game's logic that created those heroes in the first place. And even if you tear down the arenas, that logic lingers. Power belongs to the people who have killed for the cause. Legitimacy belongs to whoever can point to the most scars on camera. So the question becomes, if victors stay at the center of Panem's political life, did the games ever really end? Or did the arena just move indoors? And if that's true, wait until you see what happens when someone proposes bringing the games back on purpose. District 13's propose the games without an arena. So when Coin suggests a symbolic Hunger Games with capital children, it sounds monstrous on the surface. But here's the real question. What has District 13 been doing this whole time if not running its own version of the games without an arena? This is where we talk about the propos. On paper, they're just propaganda spots. You put Katniss in a ruined district, hand her a bow, give her a few scripted lines, and beam the footage across Panem. At face value, that feels totally different from dropping 24 kids into a murder dome. Number countdown clock, no sponsor gifts, no cannons. But watch how 13 builds these moments. Controlled settings, pre-approved angles, a whole team arguing over which of Katniss's reactions will play best on screen. It's a production. Remember how the Capitol handled the game's broadcasts? Centralized cameras, mandatory viewing, a single narrative voice telling you what each tribute's suffering meant. District 13 copies the structure almost perfectly. The content flips from look how glorious the Capitol is to look how righteous the rebellion is. But the relationship between screen and citizen doesn't change. You still sit, you still watch, you still receive a story someone else has already edited for you. And Katniss, once again, she's not a person so much as a program. In the arena, the game makers mine her grief over Rue, her rage at the Capitol, her tenderness with Peter, and turn those emotions into ratings. In 13, Plutarch and Coin mine the exact same feelings for a different purpose: belief. There is a lot to uncover here, because the reason Katniss works as the Mockingjay is the same reason she worked as a tribute. She is visibly, uncontrollably real in a system that wants to script everything. That part matters because both sides understand the same thing. You don't just fight for territory, you fight for attention. District 13 needs public, visual victories. Bombed armories, toppled dams, a song in the ashes of District 12. Why? Because a rebellion without images is just rumors. A rebellion with images becomes a shared reality the districts can't unsee. So why does it feel unsettling when you realize how interchangeable the machinery is? Studio instead of head game maker. Cropo reel instead of highlight reel. Different flag, same scaffolding. Here's the pattern interrupt. Even when 13 wins, it can't imagine ruling without a show. Coin's proposed games aren't a glitch. They're the logical next episode. The spectacle has to go on. And if that means repackaging human suffering as political theatre one more time, the system is ready to do it. We're going to cover what that means for the promise of peace in Panem, and why ending the games on paper doesn't end the hunger for a public sacrifice. Coin's vote, the almost final Hunger Games. So when Coin steps up in that council room and smiles that thin, careful smile, you think we're finally done. The arenas are gone. Snow is captured. The capital has fallen. But here's the real question. What do you do with a system that only knows how to solve problems by throwing children into a spectacle? Coin's answer is brutal in its simplicity. She proposes a symbolic Hunger Games. One last event. Only this time, the tributes will be the capital's children, specifically, the children of the most powerful. She doesn't announce it to the districts. She doesn't put it to a national vote. She gathers the surviving victors in a room and says, "We're going to cover this up as justice." Then she asks them to vote. At face value, it sounds like retribution. You took our kids, we'll take yours. But that part matters because Coin is doing three things at once. She's offering the districts a blood price that feels satisfying after generations of suffering. She's borrowing a ritual everyone already understands, so her new regime looks familiar instead of frightening. And she's testing the victors, the most dangerous people in Panem, to see who will accept the games' logic under a new flag. Watch how she frames it, not as a necessity, as a compromise, a faster path to peace. The reason that language works is because everyone in that room has been trained to believe that public sacrifice is how you reset the balance. You don't get truth commissions in Panem, you get broadcasts. This is where we talk about the votes. Johanna says yes, almost hungrily. Enoberia, whose whole career was built on the arena, says yes. Peter, who has fought the game's logic at every turn, says absolutely not. Annie, who's lost Finnick and has a baby on the way, says no too. And then Katniss, our symbol of rebellion, the girl who broke the arena, says yes. For Prim, why does that line hit so hard? Because you're seeing trauma hijack morality in real time. Katniss isn't endorsing Coin's government program. She's trying to give meaning to Prim's death by forcing the same pain onto the people she blames. Her grief pulls her back into the only justice system Panem has ever shown her. The games. The symmetry is chilling. The exact mechanism once used to punish the districts is now being repurposed to punish the capital. Same reapings, same televised cruelty, Same promise that if you watch this one more time, maybe the scales finally balance. The relationship to power hasn't changed, only the target has. And here's the real question. If Katniss hadn't killed Coin during Snow's execution, what actually stops this from becoming the new normal? The Treaty of Treason can be rewritten, the arenas can be rebuilt, symbolic games can quietly become an annual tradition of revenge. Panem wouldn't heal, it would slide seamlessly into a new era where the games continue, just with different children on the stage. Which means if you're trying to understand why peace never really had a chance, you have to ask what happens after you shoot the president on live TV, and whether that's enough to kill the idea of the games themselves. Justice or revenge? Why Panem can't agree on what peace even means. Shooting Snow on live TV feels final, but here's the real question. Once the body is gone, what do you do with everything the games taught people to want from justice? Because immediately after Snow falls, you get a split in Panem's soul. On one side, you have people talking about trials, truth commissions, tearing open the archives from the Treaty of Treason, and documenting every rigged reaping, every dead child from every district. On the other, you have people who don't want paperwork. They want a firing squad. They want capital executions broadcast in the same time slot as the arena. They want a symbolic reversal of power where the people who once clapped for the games now become the entertainment. At face value, both of those impulses are about justice, accountability, consequences, closure. But that part matters because the culture has only ever seen one template for what justice looks like on a national scale. Select victims, put them on a stage, and make them pay while everyone watches. When Alma Coin proposes a symbolic Hunger Games using capital children, she isn't inventing something new, she's just swapping out the names on the ballots. So why does that proposal land for anyone in that room? Why do victors, of all people, even hesitate instead of shutting it down instantly? This is where we talk about what decades of ritualized child sacrifice actually do to your moral math. The games have trained everyone to think suffering has to be balanced. They did it to us, now we do it to them. If District 2 got career training and extra food, if the Capitol toasted every victor while District 11 buried its kids, then any peace that doesn't hurt the right people feels rigged all over again. There is a lot to uncover here when you look at generational trauma. Some districts lost one child to the arena. Others lost dozens. Across 75 years and 3/4 quells that were pre-scripted cruelty. Entire family trees are missing branches. If your mother watched her sibling die in the bloodbath, and your grandfather still remembers the dark days, forgiveness doesn't feel noble. It feels like betrayal. Who are you to move on when your cousin's face was once turned into capital betting odds? So here's the real question. Would any form of justice that doesn't look performative even register as justice in Panem? A closed-door trial, a quiet prison sentence, reparations no one can see on screen. Does that satisfy a country raised to believe that pain only counts when it's televised? The relationship between justice and spectacle has been fused for so long that taking the cameras away makes the punishment feel fake. And without a new, shared definition of justice, one that isn't borrowed from the arena, the default is always going to be the familiar ritual. You pick a name, you build a stage, you promise the crowd that this blood will finally balance the scales. The real horror is what happens when someone realizes you don't actually need a literal arena to keep that system running. Because if the games can survive without the games, what exactly did the rebellion destroy? Trauma that outlives regimes. The games in people's heads. So if the rebellion didn't actually destroy the system, where does it keep running? Not in an arena. In people's heads, you can bulldoze the training center, but how do you demolish a nightmare that's been replaying on every screen in Penem for 75 years? This is where we talk about symptoms. Imagine Reaping Day in a post-games district. There's no glass bowl, no Effie trinket, no anthem, but anytime a crowd gathers and a name is about to be read, lotteries, job lists, even relief distributions, you feel it, that drop in your stomach. Parents gripping their kids' hands too tight. Hypervigilance spikes around any public selection process because your body remembers what your mind knows is gone. At face value, it's just a school roster. To someone from District 11 or 12, it's the games with the serial numbers filed off. Nightmares don't care about treaties. You'd have ex-tributes waking up to phantom cannons, ordinary citizens jolting at the sound of a capital jingle, entire districts with a kind of Reaping Day anxiety disorder baked into their calendar. The reason this sticks is simple. The games trained everyone to expect that safety is temporary and can be revoked with a single name. But here's the real question. What happens to the children who grew up with that as background noise? If you're 12, during the 75th Games, you've never known a year without them. You've played Hunger Games in the woods, you've argued over which victor is your favorite, you've watched kids your age die as a national ritual. Intellectually, you might hate it. Emotionally, your sense of normal is welded to it. That part matters because it shapes imagination. When those kids become adults and someone proposes a punishment, a justice system, a way to honor the dead, what template do they reach for? The arena is the only fully produced moral story they've ever seen. Crime, suffering, sacrifice, a victor crowned. There is a lot to uncover here about why the logic keeps rebooting. Katniss and Peter are the clearest case studies. Katniss flinches at a snapping twig, bolts for an empty house when District 12's fence powers up, and can barely picture a future that isn't just her family surviving the next disaster. Peter loses his leg, his memories, his relationship with reality itself. Both of them are triggered by roses, bread, fire, screaming. Even their happy ending is haunted. They have children, but she admits she spent years unable to imagine bringing kids into a world that had the games in its bones. Now scale that to parenting and politics. Traumatized parents either overprotect, teaching their kids the world as an arena, or they numb out, repeating capital slogans about necessary sacrifice because that story hurts less than we were abused. Communities might unconsciously recreate scapegoats, the capital children, the peacekeepers, anyone who looks too well fed. Coin's proposal for a symbolic final games isn't an outlier, it's the system speaking through her. So we're going to cover a hard truth. You can abolish the games on paper, melt down every arena, and rewrite the Treaty of Treason. But as long as people's imaginations are structured by that annual spectacle, the next crisis only needs one charismatic leader to say, "What if we did just one more?" And suddenly, the cameras are rolling again. Could the games have ended another way? So if the games don't really end when you blow up the arenas, could they have ended any other way? Not with a bang, but with some kind of negotiated fade out. On paper, that sounds civilized. In Panem, it's almost science fiction. Start with the most optimistic version. Snow wakes up one morning and decides to phase the games out. Maybe fewer tributes, then every other year, then gone. At face value, that sounds efficient. Less risk of rebellion, better PR with the districts, right? But here's the real question. What does Snow rule with if he gives up his annual public execution lottery? The Treaty of Treason doesn't just authorize the games, it's the spine of his political architecture. The capital's wealth, the peacekeeper's authority, the entire punishment narrative all hang on that ritual. If he voluntarily ends it, he admits the system was optional cruelty, and a tyrant who admits he didn't have to be cruel loses the one thing he can't afford to lose: the illusion of necessity. So pivot the thought experiment. Imagine a rebellion that from day one insists on restorative justice. No mass executions, no symbolic Hunger Games with capital children, no coin proposing just one more for closure. What would that actually require? You'd need leaders who hadn't been trained for war by watching kids die on television. You'd need institutions that can investigate, document, and process decades of crimes without turning every trial into another spectacle. And you'd need districts willing to sit in the same room as the people who cheered when their children were slaughtered and say, "We want truth more than we want your blood." That part matters because Panem has spent 75 years teaching everyone the opposite lesson. Could a truth and reconciliation model work when the crimes were literally primetime entertainment? In our world, those processes already struggle when atrocities are hidden. In Panem, nothing was hidden. The executions had sponsors. The trauma had commentary. Every district has a mental highlight reel of specific children dying while the capital laughed. So, what do you put on the broadcast instead? A tribunal where those same commentators apologize. Who believes that apology isn't just another show? This is where we talk about softer replacements, non-lethal competitions, symbolic rituals, maybe an annual unity games where each district sends athletes instead of tributes and the capital promises no one dies. Does that actually break the logic, or just dress it up? If you keep the same cameras, the same betting, the same victor tours, you've preserved the relationship between spectacle and obedience. You've just removed the blood until ratings dip, or a crisis hits, and someone suggests raising the stakes. There is a lot to uncover here, but all these paths circle back to the same wall. The games have rewired how Panem thinks about power. When punishment, entertainment, and national identity have been fused for generations, there's no gentle off-ramp. There's only a crash. And then the question of what you build in the wreckage. And Coin's proposal for a symbolic final games, that's our clearest hint at what most people would actually choose when faced with that wreckage. Katniss and Peter, symbols of peace or beautiful scars. So when Coin suggests a symbolic final games, you're not just hearing policy, you're hearing a promise that the arena will never really close. And then we cut to Katniss and Peter. On paper, it looks peaceful. The rebuilt Victor's Village in District 12, fewer houses occupied than ever, sitting on that same hill that once advertised the capital's generosity. Their kids run in fields that used to feed the capital's spectacle, playing where tesserae wheat and tribute coal once kept the system alive. At face value, This is the happy ending the games always pretended to offer. Win, survive, retire somewhere quiet. But here's the real question. Is this peace, or is it just the arena with better wallpaper? This is where we talk about trauma as architecture. The village survives the bombing of 12 almost untouched, preserved like a museum exhibit the capital could reuse. That part matters, because when Katniss comes back, she's not stepping into a neutral home, she's walking into a monument to everything the games did to her. Every room is a reminder. Every pantry shelf stocked by capital systems that no longer exist. You can rebuild the house. You can't reboot the nervous system of the person living there. Peter's hijacking is the clearest proof. Even in those quiet scenes with the bread and the dandelions, you know his memories have been chemically weaponized. He has to run constant reality checks just to trust his own relationship with Katniss. She hears a hovercraft or smells roses and drops straight back into the arena. Their so-called peace is basically a ceasefire negotiated between triggers. So why does their domestic life still feel oddly hopeful? Why do readers and viewers cling to that meadow with the children? We're going to cover the kids because they're not just cute epilogue content. They're a new generation that never watched the games firsthand, but grows up in the shadow of parents who did. Their bedtime stories are edited. Their family history is full of missing names. They inherit a world where the Treaty of Treason is gone, but the nightmares it produced are sitting at the breakfast table. And that raises a brutal question. Is this ending a resolution for Panem, or just one small pocket of safety carved out by two people who can never fully leave the arena behind? Katniss and Peter aren't clean symbols of peace. They're beautiful scars, proof that any future in Panem will be built on people who were trained, televised, and traumatized by the games. If your victors are this broken, what does that say about the nation they're supposed to inspire? And what happens when the rest of Panem starts demanding their own version of that meadow, the illusion of freedom? Why ending the arena isn't enough. So when the rest of Panem starts asking for their own meadow, here's the real question. What happens when you try to plant peace in soil that's been fertilized with the games for 75 years? Because the arena was never just an arena. It was written into law through the Treaty of Treason, baked into the legal DNA of Panem, so that punishment and entertainment became the same event. It ran the economy. Trains, betting, stylists, mutation labs, an entire spectacle industry that kept the capital rich and the districts dependent. It shaped culture, turning some districts into career factories where children trained for slaughter as a viable career path. And it rewired the psyche, so every family carried trauma. Every child learned that survival meant someone else's death. So you blow up the arena. So what? This is where we talk about symptoms versus structure. Removing the physical games deals with the most visible wound, but not the underlying appetite that made them profitable and popular in the first place. Why did people in the capital cheer? Why did some in the districts bet, gossip, even have favorite victors? The games gave them a ritual, a scapegoat, a countdown, a set of rules that turned terror into something you could schedule and watch after dinner. That part matters because once a society learns to cope through spectacle and scapegoating, it will keep looking for new arenas. Public executions, show trials, propaganda broadcasts starring a traumatized girl in a bird suit. We're going to cover how Coin's symbolic final games with capital children isn't a glitch in the new system. It's proof the old logic is still running underneath the reboot. And if you want a physical symbol of that lingering logic, you go back to Victor's village. Even with no new victors, those rows of empty houses in every district don't just disappear. In 12, the bombing wipes out almost everything, but the village survives, pristine. It stands there as a monument to a relationship the system tried to enforce. Your value equals your usefulness to the games. Each house says, if you had killed better, you could have lived here. It rewards survival over solidarity, training people to dream of escape instead of collective change. So what would true freedom even look like in a place built on that promise? It's not enough to cancel the reaping and call it a day. You'd have to rebuild education so children aren't raised on war footage and victor tours. You'd have to reinvent media so it doesn't rely on humiliation and blood as ratings fuel. You'd need a justice system that doesn't reach for public punishment as its first, most satisfying answer. And here's the unsettling part. Panem might never fully escape the games. The best it can do is learn to recognize when that familiar script, sacrifice a few to control the many, turn pain into a show, starts creeping back in. So when someone offers a new necessary cruelty for the sake of peace, how do you tell if you're building a future or just renovating the arena? What replaces the games? The show must go on, so if you don't rebuild the arena, what do you put in its place? Because here's the real question. You can tear down the cornucopia in a day, but what do you do with a country that spent 3 generations timing dinner around other people's deaths on TV? Post-war Panem can't just say, no more games, and fade to black. The capital and the districts still need some shared ritual, some national event that says, we're one country now, so what do you get instead? At face value, the obvious answer is something softer, maybe a national festival of survival. Annual harvest fairs where every district sends its best food, music, and crafts to the rebuilt capital. Athletic competitions where kids sprint, climb, and shoot targets, but nobody dies when they miss. You can imagine district storytellers traveling on the same rail lines that once carried tributes. Only now they're performing oral histories, reading poems about the dark days, honoring victors without replaying their kills. On paper, that sounds like the healthy version of Panem's relationship with spectacle. Same cameras, same crowds, different stakes. But this is where we talk about how fast that can slide. Because the second you rank anything, fastest runner, strongest miner, best singer, you've opened the door to a familiar script. District 1 and 2 start dominating the combat sports again. District 11's harvest displays become a yearly reminder of who feeds whom. Pretty soon, commentators are talking about career districts in gymnastics or archery, and a 12-year-old from 12 who wins a race is suddenly the new Girl on Fire brand. That part matters because the problem was never just kids killing kids. It was the promise that if you stand out enough, the capital will see you. Festivals can turn into soft power games the moment the camera zooms in on one body, one story, and sells it back to the nation as hope. And here's the pressure point. Both sides are going to crave a show. Capital citizens have withdrawal from the annual adrenaline of the arena. The districts, after years of mandatory viewing, are used to having one fixed moment when the whole country is watching them. So when someone proposes a new Unity Week, who's really going to say no? Even the serious stuff is at risk. War crimes trials, truth commissions, elections, Those are supposed to be tools of justice. But imagine them produced with the same glossy framing as the interviews with Caesar Flickerman. Defendants walked past cameras, poll numbers treated like betting odds. A presidential debate cut into highlight reels. Who destroyed whom? Suddenly, voting day feels less like civic duty and more like a finale. And once you've done that, have you actually ended the games or just reskinned them? We're going to cover how specific post-war choices in Panem push right up to that line and what it costs the people who refuse to play along. Would you vote for Coin's final games? So when Coin puts that vote on the table, it's not just a plot twist, it's a ballot being slid across the screen to you. You've seen 12-year-olds torn apart in the arena, districts bombed, victors broken and sold. So here's the real question. After everything the Capitol did, if you were sitting in that circle with Peter, Johanna, Beatty, and Katniss, would you vote yes or no on a final Hunger Games with Capitol children? Don't answer as a detached reader for a second. Answer as someone who just crawled out of Snow's war. Your family maybe died in the bombings. Your district starved while the Capitol drank neon cocktails and bet on your odds. When Coin says, for Prim or for Rue, what happens in your chest? Do you feel a flash of satisfaction or instant nausea? Because that's exactly the tension in that scene. At face value, it's a simple question of justice. They did this to us, so we do it to them. But that part matters because every victor at that table is carrying a different relationship to the games. Peter, who clung to his moral center, says no. Johanna, whose entire life was dismantled by capital torture, says yes. Katniss says yes for a very different reason, and we're going to cover that in a future breakdown. So where do you land? Do you side with Peter's refusal to repeat the horror, even if it feels unfair? Or do you feel pulled towards Johanna's rage, thinking they'll never understand unless it's their children? There is a lot to uncover here in your own reaction. If you caught yourself nodding along with Coin for even a second, that's you slipping into games logic. This is where we talk about why that's so easy. The games have trained everyone, district, capital, and audience, to solve problems with spectacle and sacrifice. One child per district, one victor. One neat story that promises closure. Coin's proposal is the same formula, just with new names in the reaping ball. So why does it feel for some people disturbingly satisfying? I want you to actually pick a vote in your head. Yes or no. Then tell me why. What's the reason you think that's justice? Is it about balance, deterrence, emotional revenge? Drop your vote and your reasoning, because those answers could shape an entire deep dive just on that scene, each victor's choice, and what Katniss is really doing when she raises her hand. And here's the uncomfortable part. The moment you start designing punishments that have to be televised, symbolic and cathartic, you're already halfway back to the arena. If even we, sitting safely outside Panem, can be tempted by that, what does that mean for a new president who still needs control and a country that still needs a show? Because Coin isn't done making offers and Katniss isn't done voting. Why the Hunger Games could never end peacefully? The core answer. Coin isn't done making offers and Katniss isn't done voting. So here's the real question. Why does that vote even make sense to the people in the room? How do you get from never again to, well, maybe one more games in a single conversation? This is where we talk about why the Hunger Games could never just fade out quietly. They're not an event. They're infrastructure. Politically, the games are the spine of the capital's control. The Treaty of Treason doesn't just punish the districts, it legally wires the games into the Constitution of Panem. Every year, every district has to send children, has to watch, has to cheer when a victor is crowned. That part matters because it fuses law, ritual, and terror into one spectacle. You're not just scared of the capital's guns, you're scared of your own screen. And the capital's relationship to that fear is very specific. Snow doesn't want pure horror, he wants managed hope, a promise. Win, and your district gets food. Win, and your family moves to a big house. Win, and you never go back in the reaping bowl. At face value, it's a reward system. In practice, it's a leash that keeps both capital and districts walking in the same direction, toward the arena, every single year. Economically, you can't just hit stop on that. Whole industries exist because the games recur. You have stylists, game makers, peacekeepers, broadcasters, betting rings, transport lines, all justified by this annual national emergency. The capital's excess needs a story to excuse it. We deserve your coal, your lumber, your children, because we keep you safe from another dark days. The games are the invoice attached to that resource pipeline. Even in the districts, careers and status get built around this horror. Victors become mentors, trainers, unofficial mayors. The arena funds their lives and their trauma. Take that away overnight, and you're not just ending a show. You're ripping out one of the main engines of class and labor in Panem. Who gives up their entire job sector peacefully? Psychologically, it's even worse. You've got generations who have grown up with ritualized child sacrifice as the calendar's biggest holiday. Kids play at Hunger Games. Families schedule their year around reapings and victory tours. The idea that someone has to pay isn't questioned, only who. Coin's proposal for a capital children games doesn't come out of nowhere. It's the same narrative, flipped. So any peaceful end would have to replace all three pillars at once. A new form of control, a new economic story, a new culture that doesn't need blood to feel balanced. There is a lot to uncover here, but the core reason it's nearly impossible is simple. You can't swap out the operating system while the machine is still running without something breaking. Which brings us back to the rebellion. They don't really end the games. They interrupt them. The arenas are destroyed, the capital falls, but the habits stay humming in people's heads. Future generations have a brutal choice. Build something genuinely new, or quietly rebuild the old patterns under different names. So when Katniss raises her hand in that vote, the real question isn't just what she wants to punish. It's whether Panem is actually ready to stop needing an arena at all. From Victor's village to ours, what Panem says about us. And here's where it stops being just Panem's problem. Because once you step out of Victor's village and into our world, you start to notice something uncomfortable. The games feel extreme, sure, but their logic, that part feels eerily familiar. At face value, the Hunger Games are a punishment written into the Treaty of Treason. Clear villain, clear victims, clear reason. But here's the real question. How different is that from institutions we all agree are harmful, yet somehow never quite manage to shut down? You can point to private prisons that profit from full cells, industries that depend on endless war, or economies built on extraction that everyone knows is burning the future. The structure survives because too many powerful people need it to. This is where we talk about spectacle. In Panem, every district is forced to watch the arena, memorize the faces, celebrate the victor. It's state violence as mandatory entertainment. Before you write that off as fantasy, think about how fast real-world suffering turns into content on your feed. A bombing, a protest, a disaster. Within minutes, there are slow-motion edits, reaction videos, monetized breakdowns. We don't have a Caesar Flickerman, but we have algorithms doing the same job. There is a lot to uncover here about identity too. For the capital, the games aren't just a show, they're who they are: superior, untouchable. For districts, being a victor becomes the only socially acceptable escape route. Your entire relationship to power is filtered through this one ritual. When a system shapes your status, your economy, your sense of self, dismantling it isn't just passing a law. It feels like erasing the ground under everyone's feet. So even when almost everyone admits it's unjust, the question quietly shifts from, should this exist, to, what would we even be without it? That's the trap. And it's why Coin can picture symbolic final games and get serious consideration. The form changes, the logic stays, and maybe that's part of why the Hunger Games story hits so hard. It's not just dystopian horror, it's recognition. You watch capital citizens cheering executions, and you remember crowds tuning in for real-world death broadcasts. You see victors turned into propaganda, and you think about how we turn survivors of violence into talking points, brands, cautionary tales. So where do you see games logic around you? Where is pain turned into a product, or punishment sold as necessary balance? And if ending it would mean losing jobs, status, or the stories we tell about who deserves what would it actually take to pull that plug? Hold that thought, because next we're going to cover what happens when you try. The costs of saying no to the arena, and why Panem makes even resistance feel like another version of the show. If you want more time in Victor's Village, so if saying no to the arena has a cost, what do you do with that? Do you walk away from Panem altogether, or do you stay in Victor's Village a little longer and keep pulling at the threads? Because there is a lot to uncover here once you start seeing the games as architecture. Snow doesn't just throw kids in an arena, he builds housing markets, mentoring pipelines, media careers, whole economic ecosystems around them. So in future videos, we're going to cover the design choices behind that system in more detail. Why Snow prefers suburbs of surveillance over prisons, why Coin reaches for the exact same tools, and what each Quarter Quell twist tells you about the capital's long-term planning. If you've made it this far, you're already in that very specific niche of people who can discuss zoning laws in District 12 and trauma-informed political theory in the same breath. So if you want more time in Victor's Village, you can stay. Hit subscribe, because the whole promise of this channel is to build a long-form archive of Hunger Games world building and political analysis. Not just what happened, but why the system needed it to happen, and what that says about our own. At face value, that's just another YouTube ask. But here's the real question. If the capital uses repetition and ritual to normalize the games, what happens if we use repetition and ritual to normalize questioning them? Every new breakdown of Coin's voting logic, every deep dive into Snow's use of hope as leverage, adds another brick to a different kind of structure, a community that doesn't let the arena be the last word. So I want to hear from you in a way that actually matters for where we go next. If you were in that room with coin at the end, what's your vote on the symbolic games for capital children, and why? Do you see it as justice, revenge, or proof that the rebellion never really left the arena at all? Tell me your reasoning, because that part matters, because it shows how you think about cycles of punishment in your own world, not just in Panem. And since we're already haunting Victor's village together, which district's version do you want a full episode on? District 4's sea-facing villas built on top of a collapsing fishing economy? District 3's smart homes wired straight into surveillance networks? Or District 2's fortified chalets where every victor is basically a retired weapon? Your answers help decide which street we walk down next. Think of subscribing less as following a channel and more as moving into a neighborhood of people who are weirdly invested in fictional housing developments, resource pipelines, and the uncomfortable relationship between spectacle and control. You're not just watching the games, you're helping map the system that makes them inevitable. Hold on to that, because next we're going to talk about what it actually costs to step outside that system, and why Panem makes even peace feel dangerous. Closing the gates, leaving the arena, not the questions. So when you step back now and look at that empty arena or that silent victor's village, it doesn't feel clean anymore, does it? The grass is trimmed, the windows are intact, but you can almost hear the echoes. You remember District 12's hilltop, 12 perfect houses, power always on, every cabinet full. At face value, it's the happy ending the games keep promising. Survive, become a victor, retire somewhere safe. But here's the real question. After everything we've covered about how the capital built its power, can a place designed as a weapon ever really become neutral ground? Katniss and Peter do get an ending. They hunt. They raise children who play in those streets that once stood empty after the firebombing. There is a lot to uncover here, because Suzanne Collins gives them domestic scenes, but never full closure. The arena is gone, the treaty is broken, Snow is dead. So why does it still feel uneasy when you picture them walking past Haymitch's decayed house, or the untouched mansions of victors who never came home? This is where we talk about systems instead of individuals. The games were never just an event. They were the spine of Panem's political and economic relationship between capital and districts. Every year, resources, attention, fear, and hope all flowed through that one spectacle. You can blow up the arena, but where does all that energy go the next day? Who decides what replaces the show? Coin's symbolic final games with capital children is our answer key. The rebellion topples Snow and still reaches for the same tool. That part matters because it proves the question was never only, could the Hunger Games end peacefully? It's what would you actually sacrifice so they never come back? Justice? The satisfaction of watching the other side suffer on screen the way you did for 75 years. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when the cannon sounds. Trauma, nightmares, hyper-awareness, those are lifelong. Now imagine rebuilding a country where every district has people like that, trained and rewarded for violence, living in little preserved pockets of privilege that survived when whole neighborhoods didn't. How do you teach a generation raised on mandatory viewing to stop needing a spectacle to make sense of their pain? Maybe the real sequel to the trilogy isn't another rebellion at all. It's the slow, boring, terrifying work of unlearning the games, dismantling Victor's village without erasing Victor's, building holidays that don't reenact trauma, teaching kids history without turning it into another arena. And you're standing at the edge of that empty cul-de-sac, doors closed, chimneys cold, wondering what gets built here next. We're going to cover more of Panem's ruins because this world leaves you with one last, dangerous question. What if the scariest thing isn't that the games continued? It's that some part of Panem might always miss them.